Welcome to this edition of the 700 Club. I have an important announcement. My wife, Dee Dee, and I were given the wonderful news on Sunday of the birth of our 15th great-grandchild, baby Adelaide. And
congratulations.
Yeah,
that is
amazing.
Remarkable. And we should say baby Adelaide has just arrived, and congratulations on that. But you have more coming. 2
more. So it'll be 16 and 17.
Wow.
Bible says, be fruitful and multiply. And I'm telling you that these children are taking off. This is a marvelous thing.
It really is. Congratulations.
But anyhow, ladies and gentlemen, that's my big news. Well, the next thing in the news is a face-off in the Middle East. Iranian officials are doubling down on threats of retaliation, and President Trump's double dare to take any action against America. But will Congress try to tie his hands? CBN Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell reports on this escalating crisis.
Iran's tributes to Soleimani reached a crescendo when his casket arrived in Tehran. From Baghdad to Beirut, Iran and its allies are promising revenge and retaliation. Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah vowed his terror group can now target U.S. troops in the region. Iran has also threatened to attack Israeli cities. The Shiite-dominated Iraqi parliament passed a non-binding resolution to kick the U.S. out of Iraq, while in Tehran, Iran announced it will no longer comply with the restrictions of the 2015 nuclear agreement. Trump threatened sanctions against Iraq if they force U.S. troops out. Oil prices are up, and the strategic Strait of Hormuz could be a key target for Iran to hit the most strategic waterway for the world's oil supply. In Washington, President Trump says the U.S. will strike back in case of any Iranian retaliation. And he's sending an additional 3,500 troops to the region and deploying missiles at embassies and U.S. bases. But House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says the strike on Soleimani put America at greater risk, and she's calling for a House vote to limit the president's military actions regarding Iran. On Sunday talk shows, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo defended the strike.
We would have been culpably negligent had we not gone after Soleimani when we had the opportunity. He was actively engaged in plotting against American interests.
Retired General David Petraeus said the strike hit Iran's most powerful military figure.
This is bigger than bin Laden. It's bigger than Baghdadi. This is the most powerful figure in Iran for the solidification of the Shia crescent and also the operational commander of the actions that they were pursuing.
Those plans included building up Iranian proxy forces throughout the Middle East, including Iraq. Pompeo says Iran wants to turn the country into a vassal state, and the Obama administration's nuclear deal helped them do it.
The Iranian government is trying to basically take over Iraq's political system. Iran is bribing Iraqi politicians. To the Iraqi people, do not allow your politicians to turn Iraq into a proxy of Iran.
While many are mourning Soleimani, others in Iraq and Iran are celebrating the death of who many consider the mastermind of terror throughout the Middle East. Despite the talk of war, some are asking if this is a time for diplomatic overtures to Iran. Yet in the meantime, there's heightened security in major U.S. cities and concern about cyber attacks on key infrastructure throughout the U.S. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
I want to make one thing very clear. We struck Soleimani, and it was a wise move. But the Iranians are going to strike back at the one responsible, they will now put the target on the president. I am so sorry. He's put himself so much into the action because he is now a target. And I would certainly call on the Secret Service. I would call on all the people who surround the president, his advance team, and everybody that goes with him to redouble your efforts because he is now a target, and the Iranians will not stop until they bring down the man who is responsible for killing their hero. Now, this man was a thug. He was a vicious person. It was a wise move to do. And certainly we don't need the Congress now trying to interfere with the foreign policy of America. But at the same time, I would call strongly on the Secret Service to redouble your efforts, especially in these rallies where the president is out and very exposed. that he himself, if he can limit his engagements, because he's going to be a target, and the Iranians will not stop until they have hurt the president. But in the meantime, we're looking at possible attacks to one of our carriers. If they try to block off the Straits of Hormuz, they could sink a few ships. Who knows what they're going to do? They could throw mines all over that area and blow up shipping. They have a whole arsenal of trouble. And we should respond to cripple their oil supplies as much as we can. But nevertheless, I just want to say that again. We need to redouble our efforts to surround the President of the United States with Secret Service, with advanced people, with all that is needed, including military, to make sure that he's kept safe. Well, joining us now from Washington is John Hanna of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, who also served as Vice President Dick Cheney's National Security Advisor. John, you were at the White House during 9/11. Well, what do you think of the next steps the administration should take?
Well, thanks for having me, Pat. Listen, this is a big gamble by the president, potentially big payoffs. He took really the greatest terrorist mastermind in the world off the battlefield. Soleimani will be very, very difficult to replace for the Iranians. It's a terrible blow for that system and their entire national security policy. I also think that it could reassert U.S. deterrence in the Middle East. It is a tremendous shock to the Iranian system. They thought Soleimani was untouchable. There has been escalation with Iran for the past 40 years, but over the past 6 months, it's become particularly acute with attacks in the Gulf on shipping, the shoot down of a U.S. drone, the attacks on the Saudi oil facilities in September. These were all met with a minimal U.S. response, real U.S. restraint. But now with the attacks on our contractor in Iraq that resulted in his death, as well as then the attack on our embassy in an attempt to humiliate the United States, the President of the United States said enough is enough, and he went just not one rung up the escalation ladder. He went several up it, killing really the second most important person in that regime, something that I think the Iranians never expected. My guess is that they're terribly unsettled right now. They don't know exactly what to do and what this president is capable of if they, again, accidentally cross one of his red lines that could bring the full wrath of American military power against Iran itself in a way that would threaten the survival of that regime, which is of course, their highest order priority. So I think right now, the United States has got to batten down the hatches, prepare for the worst, obviously, but continue to make very, very clear to Iran that while we've got things that we need to worry about here, they've got much more to worry about if they continue to push and prod and threaten Americans and American interests in the Middle East and around the world.
John, the president said we're not calling for regime change, but actually regime change is what the people of Iran want. They don't like the mullahs. That theocracy that's in place is dictatorial, and they really are laboring under the goad of their leaders. Shouldn't we go for a regime change in Iran?
Well, I think if we have had the instruments to do it, I think that's the obvious outcome. That's the way you actually settle this 40-year war between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran, is that you get rid of this regime and have a regime that actually will allow the Iranian people and Iranian culture and civilization to thrive. It's an incredibly old and talented culture and civilization. Iranians thrive anywhere around the world except in Iran itself. That's, of course, the great tragedy because of this totalitarian Islamist regime that they toil under. I do think the United States has to do much more to support human rights, not only in Iran, but in Iraq as well, and Lebanon. These are Iran's two great imperial outposts where since October, we've also seen massive demonstrations against a corrupt pro-Iranian political class. We've seen Iranian consulates burned down in Iraq. And then, of course, in November, we saw perhaps one of the greatest uprisings inside of Iran itself against this regime since the 1979 revolution, where they had to kill almost 1,500 people in a matter of days or even just a week, something the Iranians have never had to do before. They're under huge pressure as a result of American sanctions. So this strike against Soleimani, something they didn't see coming, that has really thrown them off balance, couldn't come at a worse time for the Iranian Republic, because its legitimacy of this regime has never been more in question from the Iranian people themselves.
You know, John, if we put sanctions on Iran and we bomb their, say, Harg Island, for example, of all those refineries there, that hurts the Iranian people, though. Is he going to? I mean, how do you get to the regime, the leadership, without hurting the people who really want to get rid of them?
There's no question that this has got to be an important prong of American foreign policy. Even as we're bearing down on this regime, Pat, we've got to have humanitarian exceptions in Treasury Department licensing that allows critical medicines and food to get into the Iranian people. At the same time, you've got to say that these are the most effective crushing and punishing sanctions the Americans have ever imposed on Iran. And yet, as we saw in November, the Iranian people are not blaming the United States for their horrible situation. They know that the cause of their misery and their pain and their suffering is this Islamist regime in Iran that has so brutally ruled over them for 40 years, that has completely mismanaged that economy and spent the wealth of the Iranian people not on advancing Iran's own, their own well-being, but on these wreaking death and destruction and havoc across the Middle East against not only Americans, but against Israelis. And, of course, Arabs themselves have been one of the greatest victims, particularly since the genocide in Syria, which no one was more responsible for than Qasem Soleimani.
John, about the sanctions, though, Pelosi is saying, well, the president is exceeding his authority. We need to, put congressional strictures on him. Is what they're doing is that wise, or is it even constitutional?
Well, listen, Pat, I'm one of those people who believe when the American Congress and executive branch operate in coordination in a bipartisan fashion, whether domestically or particularly internationally, America is absolutely at its strongest. So I think the president needs to do his best after he's taken this kind of action, and given the risks that we're facing, to, as frustrating, as difficult as it can be, to actually reach out to Congress and try and inform people about what his strategy is going forward, how he's going to actually protect Americans from the Iranian retaliation that is coming. At the same time, listen, there is so much hatred and polarization against the president that there are Democrats who are going to posture and scream from the rooftops against this president, but whether they're actually prepared to take any responsibility to actually interfere with American foreign policy at such a critical and dangerous time. My entire experience with the American Congress, unfortunately, is that they're not prepared to actually carry that weight of responsibility on their shoulders for the consequences of any serious action.
Gotcha, John. Thank you so much for being with us. John Hanna, tremendous word. Ladies and gentlemen, I heard the other day that Pelosi and her crowd have actually gone to a federal appeals court to see if they couldn't add other items in the impeachment vote, and yet they refused to pass that vote on to the Senate. they said, we just have to hurry. That's what they said. This president is so dangerous to America. We've got to hurry and get this impeachment through. So once they've gotten it through, then they stall. They say, well, yeah, but we've got to find out what the Senate's going to do first. And now they're trying to add other items. As one a commentator said, look, it's like you've got an indictment for manslaughter, and now you want to add another one for murder. I mean,
they don't seem to let go. Well, many have said that should the president win the next election, this will just go on. There will be more accusations.
I don't think there's any question at this point in time that he's going to win the next election. I think it would be folly to think that crowd that's out there against him, they're all fighting and they talk about socialism. They just can't have that. Well, an example of what a socialist government can do to a country is Venezuela. Venezuela's dictator has tried to take over the National Assembly. So who's now in control of that country's legislature? John Jessup has more.
Thanks, Pat. A tumultuous day in Venezuela Sunday as dictator Nicolas Maduro moved to take control of the country's legislature, known as the National Assembly. Forces loyal to Maduro blocked Assembly Leader Juan Guaido and his followers from entering the legislative palace to vote for Guaido's re-election, even pushing him back as he tried to climb a fence. Maduro backers then elected their own candidate to lead the legislature. Guaido's supporters later met at the offices of an opposition newspaper to vote him in. The United States and dozens of foreign governments recognize Guaido as Venezuela's leader, but an uprising last year failed to push Maduro from power. Well, Australia's government says it will pay, quote, whatever it takes to help communities recover from the deadly wildfires ravaging the country. Prime Minister Scott Morrison warned the fires are still burning and that they'll be burning for months to come. 2,000 homes have already been wiped out and at least 25 people have been killed as the fires have scorched so far an area twice the size of the state of Maryland. The total cost of the fires is expected to be well into the billions of dollars. Pat, Australia in much need of relief.
Well, it's an ecological nightmare. I read that 100 million animals had died in those fires. Now it's up to as much as 1 billion.
Half a billion at least. Yeah. Now 1 billion? Wow.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Amazing.
100 million to 1 billion. I mean, but those koala bears and all those kangaroos and the people, it's an incredible thing. And it's very shocking as to what happens. But let's pray for them. It looks like it's going to get a little cooler, and they need rain desperately. The Australian Navy's been picking up people on the coast who are in danger, and it's one of the most awful ecological disasters that I have seen in my lifetime. Well, there was a meeting in Florida, in Orlando, to mourn the passing of a dear, dear friend of mine, REINHARD BONNKE. John has more on that.
That's right, Pat. Christian leaders met there in Orlando, Florida this weekend to remember the life of evangelist REINHARD BONNKE, who died December 7th. The service was also a passing of the torch to the next generation. CBN President and CEO Gordon Robertson was there, and he shared how God changed the course of his life when he attended a BONNKE crusade in India in 1994 with Pastor John Jimenez.
I saw 300,000 people, which for REINHARD was a small crowd. 300,000 people there, and literally half of them gave their heart to Jesus Christ. As they were doing that, John Jimenez leaned over to this rebellious preacher's son and said, "You can do that too." At the point in time of my life where he said that to me, everything within me laughed. You have got to be kidding. But I want to lean over this podium into you and say, we're here today, to pass the torch. And I want to assure you that you can do it too.
BONNKE's ministry recorded an amazing 77 million salvations in his decades as an evangelist. And Pat, I like what Gordon said there. God can use anyone.
Yeah. Well, as I said in my letter to him, about every 100 years, somebody comes along that the Lord has anointed. And there hasn't never been anybody like REINHARD BONNKE. I mean, never. The number of people. In one meeting, he had 1 million decisions in one meeting. And in Nigeria, he had 5 or 6 million people in the audience. And the anointing of the Holy Spirit, miracles. This man was incredible. He's a dear, dear friend. We miss him, but in the whole century, there's never been anybody like him. I mean, you can think about Americans doing this, that, and the other, but nothing like Bonnke. So our hearts go out to his family, his loved ones, and Danny Kalinda, who is his successor. I just pray for Christ for all nations, it is called, that it might prosper and be blessed. As Gordon said, the torch is now being passed.